Well, kia ora koutou. My name's Wendy Sullivan. I'm the Marlborough Catchments Coordinator for New Zealand Landcare Trust. Welcome to today's webinar, which is Wetland on Your Farm. Just a bit of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and we'd love you to ask lots of questions. So if you do have any questions, just pop them into the chat button at the bottom of your screen and we will answer them at the end of Nathan's presentation. If we run out of time to answer all the questions, we will answer them and send them out via email. So I'll shortly be handing over to Nathan. So Nathan is our Regional Coordinator for Hawke's Bay here at New Zealand Landcare Trust. And prior to that, he's worked for various regional councils around New Zealand, fish and game, and extensively in this field in the United States. We actually have a wide range of participants from around the country joining today's webinar, so it's not just those in Marlborough. So we're going to focus on generic concepts as opposed to regional rules and limits. Now, Nathan is an expert in his field at constructive wetlands, and you'll see in his presentation, he's going to take our thinking beyond the usual planting and weed control that we tend to stick to in our wetlands. But please keep in mind, most techniques are likely to require resource consent. So always talk to your council planner before starting any work that involves diggers. Right, Nathan, I'll hand it over to you.
Kia ora, everybody. My name is Nathan. I'm at the regional coordinator at Hawke's Bay. So just up here in the north, and usually we say the dry north, but lately it hasn't been so dry. It's been a real weird year, and we have more wetlands than we know what to do with. Today I'm going to talk about wetlands and your farm environment plan, but just basically, if we move a little bit away from, well, not move away, but just wetlands on your farm and how you plan around wetlands on your farm and protect them, and a little bit around the policy that is set up around wetlands. So what goes into a farm environment management plan, and what concerns us around, what is major interest of us around wetlands is the mapping. So if you do a farm environment plan, and even if you don't have a farm environment management plan yet, you'll generally have a map of your property. In that map, you'll most likely identify wetlands that you have on the property. You might identify areas that get wet that you might want to put wetlands in. Or you might actually identify areas and say, hey, this area here, we drained wetlands in the past, or we tried to drain it, or my grandfather tried to drain it, just hasn't happened, or it just doesn't drain well. So what can I do? And then some of the little bit of discussion around stock exclusion planning, and then a little bit around critical source areas and using wetlands to remove nutrients from the waterways before, or from the surface flow before it goes into your waterways. It's going to be a little bit general. Again, each region varies on policies and that kind of thing, but I'll stick with the national policy, which is the bare minimum, and some councils will have some stricter rules and regulations. And the last thing is this action list, and we'll talk a little bit about your action list for wetlands. So the freshwater policy statement, which came out a few years ago, on policy 6, says there is no further loss to the extent of natural inland wetlands. Their values are protected and the restoration is promoted. These values protected includes cultural values along with biodiversity values and that kind of thing. So the reason that this policy was put in is New Zealand's lost 90% of the wetlands, and even with the RMA in place, we still are losing wetlands in some regions, and we can't afford to lose much more. Partly because they actually is a way of reducing flooding, which is an issue that's very prevalent up here in Hawke's Bay right now. The go-to is the Resource Management Act, and it defines a wetland as permanently or intermittently wet areas. And that's really a key thing, is this intermittently wet areas. We have what we call ephemeral wetlands, that are wet during wet times of year and then slowly dry out throughout the summer, and will dry out completely. We call them ephemeral seasonal wetlands, and they are actually quite important. They have a diverse biota and wildlife to them. Mudfish and water birds use them because they're actually highly productive wetlands. So they're important. We've lost the majority of these intermittently wet areas. Shallow water and land water margins. That land water margins is those margins around lakes that are wetlands, because the lake is too deep to be considered a wetland, but the margin is a wetland. And basically shallow water, internationally, they consider anything under a meter deep of water is considered a wetland. So, and then they support the natural ecosystem of plants and animals that are adapted to wet conditions. And that's this adaptation is probably the key feature that we'll be discussing. So a little bit of issues are not issues, but there's a little bit of people were worried around the national policy statement and like, oh, but I built a wetland on my property a few years ago, and now I won't be able to do much with it. But the the policy statement basically says a natural wetland isn't one that was constructed by artificial means. So if you created a wetland on your property for biodiversity or a duck pond for shooting and stuff, that's not included on there because it's not a natural wetland. It's one that was created. I won't touch geothermal wetlands because they're a unique little bit of a wetland, and most likely you don't have them on your property anyways. And then there's this one, this improved pasture, that on the commencement dates of the national policy statement is dominated by 50% exotic pasture species. And this is where these are those ephemeral wetlands that have been developed. I think Fed farmers originally wanted to put it down as wet paddocks. They're wet during the winter time, they dry out, and they've been developed around that area. But so those areas that have been developed, those ephemeral wetlands that have been developed, aren't included unless and you can't develop any more of them, basically, as of 2 years ago. So from a biological standpoint, and that's the standpoint I generally go by, what is a wetland? It's hydrology is the main thing. It's wet land. It's land that's wet. Doesn't matter if the water is at the surface or right at the root zone. When you walk across it or you do something to it, it's wet, and it's wet for basically for the growing portion. So our ephemeral wetlands are wet through the winter and most of the summer, and they dry out through summer, but they're wet enough that they don't dry, or they don't grow those terrestrial plants. We look at hydric soils as a way of defining wetlands, and those are actually, are they peat soils? Are they soils that are anaerobic, don't have any oxygen in? If they're saturated, they won't have any oxygen in, and that's a way to do it. And there's several keys to deal with soils. And then we look at wetland biota, which is the species living in the wetlands. Most wetland ecologists in New Zealand really use that as their way of defining where the wetland is, and it's looking at those plants that actually need wet feet to grow, or they emerge out of the water. And if they have those plants, which we call obligates, that's usually the wetland itself. And we define the wetland based around those plants, but usually a good ecologist will use all three to define the wetlands. But you'll find that most practitioners basically use the biotas as their main go-to, and then they'll look at hydrology and soils afterwards. And your farm environment management planner a lot of times will just look at that, look at what plants are growing, and go from there. So as we're moving forward, I'm going to use some terms, and I like some clarification of terms for you. When I say wetland restoration, it refers to returning a wetland to a former condition. That definition is changing a little bit, more to the former hydrology. I'm sorry, I bumped my keyboard. When we talk about wetland creation, it's basically putting a wetland where a wetland never existed before. And when we talk about wetland construct, you'll hear a lot of people talk about constructed wetlands. And basically a constructed wetland is a wetland that's been created to treat a whole bunch of different things: municipal wastewater, gray water, and stormwater runoff. So we use constructed wetlands on a farm landscape to capture surface water and treat it for usually nutrients before it flows into the waterways. And then we'll talk about, I just want to mention enhancements, and that's activities which increase the function of wetlands. So a lot of times we call people are planting wetlands and they call it wetland restoration, but really it's enhancement because the wetland's actually functional. It's just putting plants in that have been missing or establishing those things. So it's more of an enhancement activity than a restoration activity. So you got your farm environment plan sitting there in front of you, and you're sitting there and going, now what do I do? It's got all this stuff in, it's identified wetlands, it's done this, it's done that. What do I need to do? And around this, you know, I always tell farmers, you just need to prioritize what you do and make a plan over the next 5-10 years of what you're going to do. High priority is protecting those existing wetlands. Partly is because those existing wetlands are actually good at removing nutrients, and when there's only 5% of them left, they're extremely important. And legally, you have to protect those wetlands. So it's just basically excluding stock, putting a little bit of a buffer around when you fence things up. As you're going through, you've identified your wetlands, and then you're thinking, oh, we have this wet area down here. We tried to drain, but it hasn't drained. It probably was a wetland at one time. You might want to say, well, it's not productive, so let's just restore the wetlands and have a nice little wetland there for water quality or for biodiversity. So that would be your second priority on your list. You're like, okay, we've identified these areas, and this is what we want to restore the wetlands. Usually that's fixing the hydrology of the wetlands. Usually they've been drained and stuff, and I'll talk about how we do that a little bit later. And then after you fix that hydrology, again, it's stock exclusion. When you talked about stock exclusion, I'd recommend people, because you can't spray within 10 meters of a wetland. I suggested that actually makes a really good buffer to start out with. The wider your buffer around the wetland, the better, but a 10-meter buffer is actually a pretty decent buffer around your wetland to protect it and allow for some terrestrial plants to grow. And then third, especially if you're in a catchment that has high nutrients in the waterways and stuff, we need to look at creating new wetlands or constructing wetlands. So priority, again, is, you know, protecting. Secondary is restoring, and thirdly is creating new wetlands and around those constructed wetland areas. So like I said, wetlands come in all shapes and sizes and do all kinds of different things. This beautiful wetland here has some non-native grasses in, but it is a wetland that needs to be protected and fenced. And as you can tell, there's no open water because the water is right at the groundwater level or right below it. So it's a sort of a unique little wetland. A little bit about seepage wetlands. These aren't really covered under the national policy statement because they're generally small. I think the policy statement says half a hectare, but these seepages, based on work done by NZ and NIWA, these seepage wetlands are actually really good at removing nutrients. So fencing those seepage wetlands and protecting them, maybe even planting like this one up, would actually help improve your water quality. And also there's some unique biodiversity that uses these seepage wetlands. Again, you'll find these seepage wetlands sometimes in these gully systems. It's nice and wet, and the water just seeps through the wetland. It doesn't flow through, it just kind of seeps through. A lot of times they're a little peaty, but they are worth protecting. Is like this farmer's done. He's protected, and he's going to plant up around that wetland with some trees for biodiversity. But kept the stock out there. It's a little too mucky for stock, but again, that water is going to flow through this catchment, down through the seepage. Some of it's going to seep in, some of it's going to get filtered across the top, but it will remove a lot of nutrients. So when we're doing planning and that kind of thing, we always got to weigh the pros and cons and think about long-term management. The advantages of protecting these seepage wetlands is basically it's low cost. It's a little bit of fencing and some planting. Anybody can do it. Not a lot of work. They're easy and cheap to maintain once they get planted, and you take care of any weeds and stuff. They usually generally take care of themselves. You just got to keep an eye on them every once in a while for weeds. They don't require a lot of land because they're small, so you're not impacting your productivity of the land that much. They do have biodiversity values, and because they're seepages, they slow water down, which will reduce downstream flooding. The disadvantage is if you have high strength effluents, you don't want to send it down through there because they just can't handle, or they can't take up the nutrients from that. So you don't want any effluent going down through there. And there's sometimes if you can install weirs and slow that water down through those seepage wetlands and allow for those wetlands to uptake more nutrients. So if you do install small weirs, there is some maintenance to those as you do it. Generally, you don't have to. It's planted up in native sedges. It'll slow the water down nicely. Restoring wetlands. Usually we restore wetlands that are in poor production areas. So again, you're not affecting your productivity that much. After you get them established and restored, they're usually easy to maintain. Once you get the hydrology right, and you get plants in there and stuff, there still is a little bit of a weed issue off and on, but it's not that bad of an issue. Generally lower cost than if we're constructing a wetland separately to handle more nutrients. Restored wetlands are very effective at taking up nutrients, and they have high biodiversity values, and again, reduce downstream flooding because you're slowing water coming off the land. It's going through the wetland, it's soaking through that wetland, and then it slowly comes out of that wetland. So you're reducing the amount of water flowing downstream. Again, it's not suitable for high strength effluents. And most likely, with some of the new rules and regulations, you probably will be required a resource consent to restore it. And generally, some of it's large land requirements, but again, we go back to it's usually poor productive land anyway. So you got to weigh those pros and cons as you're making those decisions in your farm plan. When we restore wetlands, we use the various techniques. A lot of times we're filling drainage ditches, we clean them out and dig around and key in and block those drainage ditches. And actually, that's a lot of times what we have to do to restore a lot of wetlands. It's quick and easy. Some wetlands in the past have been filled by sediments, especially around here right now with Cyclone Gabriel. Might have to excavate some out. In the past, I've breached dikes and levees to reconnect wetlands with streams and rivers to reduce flooding. It helps restoring stream flows, actually helps those wetlands, especially floodplain type wetlands. Controlling sediment and other pollutants. I'll have a little bit of chat about that a little bit later. We'll touch on that. A big one here in New Zealand is controlling those exotic species and replanting the species we want. Generally, we don't have to reintroduce fish or other wildlife, but sometimes we do, especially mudfish, those kind of things. You need permits to do it, but when you're thinking about your land, you might think like, oh, we've got something here, and you start having those conversations with the Department of Conservation, the Regional Council. Controlling predators is a key here, especially for if we want to encourage bittern and rail use. Buffers, restoring buffers. Again, I was talking about that 10 meters is probably a minimum that I would recommend. And just restoring that connection between other wetlands, rivers, and waterways. So just a really quick, I'm looking across a farm environment plan, and I'm looking at the maps, and we find an area like this. You can see the drain going down the middle of this scrubby area. This is a drained wetlands. We can come in here for, a fairly low cost and block those drainages in places and reflood that wetlands and use that wetland. You can see there's actually 2 parallel drains and then a couple side drains going down. But by restoring that wetland, you got this whole catchment around it. This is up in Northland, actually, going into this, and that will help actually remove nutrients before it gets down into the stream down below in the waterway. And so these are the places we tend to look for when we're talking about restoring wetlands. They're just drained wetlands that are still scrubby and just low value because it's just too wet for grazing. So constructed wetlands. Now, these are wetlands that we construct to actually remove nutrients from surface water flows across our farmlands. They have high ecological values because they're wetlands, you know, and there's an opportunity to treat high contamination. And in some parts of the world, I've seen piggeries where the constructed wetlands treat a piggery, and the effluent coming off the piggery goes through a series of 12 wetland cells. And by the time the water comes out of that bottom cell, it's actually clean enough to drink. So they're really good at that. But they've got to be designed specially to reduce flow, especially high effluent flows, to slow it down to almost a meter a day of flows. So you have a high retention time of those effluents if you're constructing effluents. But what we're talking about today is mainly just surface water flows. Again, large land requirements, and we'll get into that a little bit later, most likely will require a resource consent. And most constructed wetlands, there's a maintenance commitment to it because they've got pipes and connectivity and that kind of thing, which need to be cleaned, protected. And there's a higher construction cost for these constructed wetlands, partly because they are multi-celled and usually fairly large. When we are constructing a wetland to remove nutrients, we are trying to shoot for 1 to 5% of the catchment that the water flows into that wetlands. Generally shooting for 3 to 5 would be ideal, but that 1 to 5 gets you a good removal of nutrients out of those surface flows. Your wetlands should be elongated, so it allows for more contact with plant life and that kind of thing, and not around more of an oval shape of 5 to 1 or 10 to 1 ratio. Again, most constructed wetlands will have a deep pond, and then they'll have a shallow area, and then they'll have another deep area. And the shallow area is usually less than 300 mils, and that covers 70% of the wetland. And that's where your vegetation grows up, your emergent vegetation that helps take nutrients out. And then your deep waters is either sedimentation or used to kill E. coli, because the deep water, you don't have vegetation growing in, so you get the UV rays that will kill the E. coli. So they do vary, constructed wetlands. This is a NIWA design here in Hawke's Bay with a sediment trap, and you can see the 2 deep ends are starting to fill up. This is just right after it's done. You can see where they hydroseeded, and you can see where they planted the emergent vegetation before it filled up. And so high cost, very, very, very strong. You can see there's culverts here, there's culverts there, there's culverts here. There'll be the culverts aren't in yet. There's culverts there, and there's culverts here. So those culverts have to be maintained. If any wetland fails, they usually fail around those. You got to keep them clean from vegetation, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit of an ongoing maintenance with them. But you can do simple constructed wetlands, end of field wetlands, when you're taking a small field and you're putting it through a treatment wetland. This one has 2, 3 cells into it, and these are shallow cells. While the first shell here is open water, and the second one's shallow, it's just the vegetation hasn't started yet growing in that. And the third one, again, is a shallow cell with a deep end in it. And of course, I've got these grass buffers between them that actually help with nutrient uptake. Another simple constructed wetland that's low cost is at the end of tile drains. This is the Pomahaka catchment. The water comes out of a tile drain into this open water area, which is a sediment trap and also helps kill E. coli. You can see the algal growth in there, which kind of indicates that there's a high nutrient level in there. And then it meanders through this wetland. Another constructed wetland that I actually like and have done a few of are what we call in-ditch wetlands. So we take a drainage ditch, which is keeping water off the land. We widen it and put a shallow wetland in it to take up nutrients and to remove nutrients. This is generally low cost and doesn't take a lot of productive land out. Another in-ditch wetland, we had to put, because of the steep gradient of this drain, we had to put some grade control structures in, so we get nice shallow water through the whole part of the drain. This is filling up. That'll be a basin of wetlands. Again, very simple compared to those. We do have a deep area here. You can't see it because we're in there working, but we have a deep sediment trap there, and then we had some open water down here to help remove nutrients. If you're interested in constructed wetlands, NEWA has put out multiple guides along with Dairy NZ. The latest is this constructed wetlands practitioner guide, which is very good, a little technical, but has a lot of case studies and a little bit of costing to give you a little bit of idea of what a constructed wetland cost. When I'm looking at farm environment plans with landowners and maps, and we're looking for the small end of field wetlands, I'm looking for these low areas where water will flow off the land and sit, and we can create wetlands in these low areas to take that water, surface water, and treat it before it goes down into the stream. Now, all that pampas grass back there is a stream that flows through there. So this area is actually a really good place that we could actually put a small treatment wetland to deal with. This was about a 10 or 15 hectare paddock that would flow into that. So we don't have to have a big wetland because it's actually a small area. Again, another wetland we did in Northland. This was for both biodiversity and a little bit for water quality, but you can see the lay of the land where we have water coming in. We got water coming in from several places, so we allowed for multiple pathways for the water to move, elongation of the waterways. This will fill up. These are fairly deep, and this will be shallow. So we get the deep and shallow, and then another deep hole before it goes down into the stream that goes. Just taking those constructed wetlands and adding the values of those constructed wetlands, but adding those biodiversity values to it. Because constructed wetlands and treatment wetlands take a lot of land, I do what I call, a lot of times we'll do what we call treatment chains. So here we've got a sediment trap, and then it flows over, which this will be a sedge area bed into all these wetland cells. And so we get this treatment. We got a little bit of deep water here, mainly because the landowner wanted the shack to have some deep water in front just for views. The next wetland down shallow, and the next wetland is down shallow until it gets to the end, another deep hole. Sediment traps, I put in almost all my wetlands. I didn't think I needed one here, but I put it in anyways. The water flows across this flat area. So we built up the dirt that we dug out of the sediment trap here. So it backs up, and then the water will flow out the sides into the wetland. Didn't think we needed it because we had a farm pond just right above it, but 6 months later, it was half filled with sediment. So there's a lot of sediment coming off the land. And here's a picture of that sediment trap. And you can see all the algal in it, which indicates that there's a good bit of phosphorus coming in to that. And the sediment trap was working really well. And so when I'm restoring a wetland or creating a wetland, the way I design the wetlands are very similar. You put, I don't want to call it a dam because usually it's not a dam. It usually is just a little bit of a bund because I don't like high dam walls because we end up with deep water. And and I want this 1 to 6 sloping sides. And the reason for that is if we have a major event like we did a couple weeks ago up here in Hawke's Bay with Cyclone Gabriel, water will just flow right over this and it won't erode it. Where if you had a traditional dam wall, if your water flowed over it, it would tear out the back because of the steep slopes. But we generally dig down to an impermeable layer and put a clay plug in. And then we build that clay plug up to where we want the water level to be. And also this way, I don't have to worry about any freeboard, because if the wetland gets up to here, again, if it flows over, we don't have to worry about it. So this is a tradition. This is a typical drain. This was a wetland that was drained. We cleaned out to that impermeable layer, and then we compacted that with clay. Those clay soils we played down in about 15-centimeter layers, and then compacted it with running the digger over it. It's a 20-ton digger, but I usually use a 16 or 20-ton digger, and compacted that fairly well. And you can see it is sort of a dam wall, but it isn't. It's level with the ground. It just looks like a dam wall, but the backside is actually, you can't even see the wall, and it actually disappears in the landscape when it's done. But we compact that, and then we form bowls, and then yep. And then we usually generally have a spillway. Usually the spillway goes over untreated soil that we don't have to worry about it. But you can see it's not that high of a dam. 1 to 6, this was a 1 to 5 slope because we didn't have enough material to do 1 to 6. And that's the wetland in the background. After we do the construction and do the topography, I spread topsoil over that, especially those exposed clays, because it keeps the water clear. But those exposed soils are critical for nutrient reduction, because you need carbon in the bottom of the wetland for that anaerobic denitrification. If I'm doing biodiversity, we create some topography, we create a little bit of islands and add some pools into areas. So, but those pools are those deep water habitats that actually remove nutrients if we are doing a constructed wetland. Again, if I'm doing biodiversity, wood is critical for a wetland, and then you wait for the water to come in. And this is that wetlands 3 months later, looking really nice. We go in and we plant the buffer strips up, and when we do wetlands this way, for biodiversity and a little bit of water quality, generally the maintenance is low because we don't have any culverts or anything in it. So I'd like sort of like a hybrid between a constructed wetland and a wetland for biodiversity. So I'm trying to meld both of them together. But when we want water quality and biodiversity, we still got to maintain that 30% emergent vegetation, which is those rushes here in the background. They're growing out of the water, and that 70% of that, the wetland, should be in those emergents, and 30% open water. And you want some open water at the top and in the bottom of the wetland. And I will open that one up for questions there, Wendy.
Great, thanks, Nathan. We do have a question that was sent in prior to the webinar starting, but if you do have any questions, pop them in the chat. Hopefully the chat function is working. It wasn't when I did my last webinar, but hopefully this one is. So Stephen lives on the banks of the Opawa River. So the Opawa River, for those who don't know, is an oxbow river. It doesn't have flowing water where he wants to plant, but the water table rises considerably in winter depending on rainfall. So what is the best way to reintroduce native species without them drowning in the winter?
I would go with the species that can handle those wet, dry movements. So a lot of your native sedges and balmia. I'm sorry, I'm throwing technical terms here, but there's no common names for a lot of them. And some of your rushes actually can handle that flooding, drying regime. So just the best thing is to sit down with a good nursery in your area and having a chat with them and saying, this is the issue, it fluctuates. There are some, depending upon the fluctuation, there are some shrubs and trees that will handle that. Cacatias will handle that if they're grown properly, but you've got to grow those in a nursery where you're mimicking that regime. So if you have cacatias, I would suggest you actually grow them on the side. where they get a little bit of a wet feet, and then let them naturally move in. What you want to do with any wetland planting is you don't want to do a complete plant and make it look like a mature wetland. You want to jumpstart that process. So I always recommend just jumpstarting that process. But most of your native sedges, your giant umbrella sedge is actually a really good one that will handle that wet dry. Caricsectas and some of your balmias and that kind of thing. So again, you just want to get it started, and they'll propagate themselves through it. Your juncuses also, a lot of your juncuses will handle that wet dry.
Yes, it is rather tragic when your plants drown after planting them. So that's really interesting, particularly about the Kahikatea, because I was talking to a dairy farmer that planted Kahikatea in her swamp, and unfortunately, it was a very wet summer we had. They died. But yeah, so you're saying that we should be able to flood them in the nursery and get them used to that regime. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yep. I unfortunately haven't been able to follow up on it, but when I was in Northland, I had a grower grow some of mine in with their feet in water completely, because I was planting a floodplain that was wet 80% of the year. And I planted a few thousand, but I haven't been up to there. Shortly after I planted them, I moved to Hawke's Bay, and I haven't been up that far up in Northland to check on them. But having a chat with the grower who did it, he's actually he's found that he can, if he knows what he's growing for, he can manipulate that in the seedlings and have fairly good success. Same way with Manuka, because Manuka will grow with a wet foot, but if you grow it dry and you put it in a wet foot, it won't grow. It'll die. So most of those plants that we see in wetlands, those trees and shrubs will be the same way. But sedges and rushes, get them in there, get them started, let them take over, and then plant the others up on the edges of the drier areas and let them naturally just take over. Really, you just want to jumpstart it.
Great. The next question is on weed control, convolvulus. Do you have any tips on dealing with convolvulus? I know with dealing with vines, it's often just a matter of getting in and cutting and pasting, but what's your tips?
Convolvulus, yeah, you cut and paste is okay. Unfortunately, the best stuff to use for it is chemicals like metsulfuron or Escort or one of those, which you can't spray over wetlands without consent. If you spray Roundup, which generally is allowed in most regions to spray over wetlands without a consent, it'll burn them, but it won't do anything. And the only time I would worry about them is when you're trying to establish plants, and especially trees and shrubs. Once they're up and established, the convolvulus shouldn't be too much of an issue. And there is a native one and a non-native one. I can't tell the difference between the two, but I'm not a botanist.
John is asking, what do you recommend doing with the sediment collected from the sediment trap? So presumably if it's spread or deposited in the wrong place, it will run back to the sediment trap.
Yeah, that's right, John. Recommended, usually most guys will spread it out below the wetlands or areas that you can put it back on the paddocks during the dry part of the year. And because it usually even despite them being in the sediment trap, they're still usually, and the algae growing, and there's still usually a high nutrient level to them. And if, even though they're anaerobic, when they're in the sediment trap, as soon as you get them out, they're actually really good to spread across. But again, yeah, you want to make sure that you spread that during a dry time of the year over grass or established grass that isn't grazed too short. Because if you graze your grass too short and there's exposed soil, it'll wash back down through. Yep, it is a bit of a challenge, and hopefully that's temporary, those sediment traps, until you get other things in the way. And filters actually work really well. I use sedges as filters and plant a whole bunch of sedges up above that help filter out. So your sediment trap is only a temporary thing. But you'll be surprised how much sediment you lose when you put a sediment trap in. I've had farmers tell me that, oh, we don't lose that much sediment. We put sediment trap in and like cleaning it out a year later. And they're like, wow, we didn't size that one properly, there are some guidelines around sizing sediment traps, and almost every regional council has a little bit of guidelines around those.
Thank you. Nicola is asking, in practice, what would you say is the biggest challenge to making a successful constructive wetland?
The biggest challenge is getting that 70-30% and making sure that you've got adequate flow to maintain the wetland, because you're usually using surface flow for that, and so you want to make sure. And the other is to make sure it's sized properly, and that's always a challenge, because that 1 to 5%, and I generally go 3 to 5%, is a fairly bit of land. But like I said, I'm looking. You can't always get that, so we're trying to do those treatment chains. And the other thing is the failures I've seen is people don't key that clay key in that goes down the impermeable surface, so they'll make a little bit of a bund. In the same way on restoring wetlands where it's a drain, they'll just put dirt in and compact it and go it. But you've got when you do that, if you don't clean it out to an impermeable layer, the water will just go underneath where you did it. And I've even had guys with dams just going like, there's water leaking out underneath it. It's like, wow, it's because you didn't clean it out and put a good key in to prevent that water from going under. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. People just like, oh, they go down to a mineral layer and then build it, but soil's laid down in layers, and those waters flow through the layers. So by cutting that key in, will break those layers up and actually force that water to stop from going out from underneath. So those are your biggest challenges if you get that water from going out from underneath. And the second is, if you're doing a constructed wetland, your biggest challenge after it's done is just maintaining those culverts and making sure they don't wash out or get water underneath them or clog up during a big storm and blow out. That's where your failures are going to happen.
Sorry, what was the 30-70 ratio for again?
For 30% deep water, 70% shallow water, and shallow is about 300 mils.
All right, we've got no other questions coming through, but I went to a wetland the other day and they want to re-wet it because at the bottom of the wetland, back in historic times, they'd put in a drainage ditch. Now I presume that would have originally been a stream outlet.
Probably, yep.
But now the drainage ditch does have some biological value. So how do you sort of re-wet a wetland without compromising the drainage ditch / outlet stream?
Yeah, you can block the drain at the wetland and direct the overflow back into the drain below the wetland. So you cut across and block it, so hold that hydrology up, and then when you put your spillway, you direct it right back into that drainage area, and probably would improve it because your wetland would slowly release water over time, where now with the drain it gets these flushes of water.
So slow it down and let it infill a little bit.
Yep.
All right, thanks, Nathan.
Yep. Got another question there. Got
another question. Do you have any recommended templates, project plan for wetland enhancement projects? Funders are often wanting to see a written plan.
I do one myself that is very basic but it's one that I use whenever I'm on site, and it just is. I use it mainly to remind me when I go back and write up a plan, what I'm looking at. And I might be able to bring it up pretty quickly here if I'm. And of course, when I go to look for it, I can't find it, but basically identify water flows and or whether the wetland is going to take surface water or groundwater, techniques used, what's there, what isn't, and a few other things that I search for.
So that's something we could share after the webinar, perhaps.
Yeah, I can pop one to and I can pop one to you, Wendy, that you can use. It's not finalized. I keep playing around with it and getting it to it, but it basically identifies what your water flow is, what techniques you're going to use to restore it, and that kind of thing. There's no planting plan on it yet, but Wendy's developed one for a planting plan, didn't you, Wendy? I think you developed it. That could go with it. But and then it's just allows me to I do it on site or right after I'm on site, but it's just mainly for me to, when I go back and write up a plan for it, it's just gives me those key notes that I need when I write the plan up.
Something to send to council for the resource consent, presumably too.
It would be the start, yeah. It wouldn't be everything, because basically it has all the data I need, and I just write it up what my plans, how I'm going to do the work. But yeah, I use it for my funding as to write up my funding thing.
Cool. All right, now we'll share that out to everybody when we send out the recording.
Yep.
So a question: what predators should be the focus of pest control for bringing back bitterns and rails?
Yeah. Cats. Yep, I think your biggest one, especially for bitterns, are cats. Rails too. Cats, rats, and ferrets. Stoats to some extent. Weasels generally don't like a wet foot, but if you're trapping ferrets and cats, you're going to catch your stoats and weasels also. But I think cats are, from the bittern research we're finding up here, it looks like cats are a major predator of bittern. And despite what everybody says, they do like getting their feet wet when there's a good meal for them. Rails, probably not as much because they're smaller. Rails would probably be more rats, I would say, to deal with. So, but yeah, I mean, any mammalian predator will take them, John. So yeah. So if you do a sweet, you'll be okay. But yeah, again, like I said, cats are the big one that we just got to deal with somehow.
And of course, trapping in a wetland when you've got fluctuating water levels is a nightmare as well. Yeah,
it is. And that's where you set up a perimeter and you trap the perimeter. And unfortunately, you probably get most of your mammals. The rats, it's a little harder, but your ferrets and your stoats will follow the perimeter and go in when they find scent lines and stuff. And same way with cats. Rats, you almost need to send in a grid of some sort of poisoning baits or something like that. Again, it's really hard in a wetland that fluctuates a lot, but it's tough. Yeah.
All right, it seems like we don't have any more questions for now, but if people do have questions that you would like to ask, you would have had an email from me, so just send me an email and I will get Nathan to reply. Yep. So Nathan, I'd like to thank you for being our technical speaker today and sharing your knowledge, and I'd like to thank the participants for taking time out of your day to come and join the webinar. I will be sending out the recording if you want to re-watch it, or send it to anyone else, and I will also send out those wetland and planting templates as well. Yep. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and everyone have a lovely day.